to the deep dive. We've got some really interesting material you sent over, and as always, we're going to dig into it together, pull out the main ideas, and hopefully make it all clear.
Sounds good.
So today we're looking at, well, a student project that seems quite innovative, and maybe even more importantly, a different way it was assessed. It's about focusing on what students can do, their strengths.
Exactly. What we have here is an example of an industrial revolution invention story fractal grid. Quite a mouthful.
It is, yeah.
And then there's the bias-aware assessment grid that was used alongside it. And the really interesting part, I think, is how this assessment tool tries to be, asset-based. It highlights what the student actually shows.
Rather than just looking for mistakes.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it aims to be more objective, trying to get past potential evaluator blind spots.
Okay, so let's start with the project itself. This Industrial Revolution Invention Story Fractal Grid. What was the actual task for the student? It sounds, well, pretty structured.
It definitely is structured. The main goal was for the student to analyze an invention from that period, the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
Using this thing called the Fractal Grid framework. You can sort of picture it as looking at the invention from 4 different angles, all connected.
4 angles?
Yeah. The problem the invention was trying to solve, the actual solution that was created, the method they used to make it work, and then an evaluation of, its impact.
Okay, so it wasn't just describe this steam engine. It was much more about the context, the why,
Right.
and how, and so what.
Exactly that. They had to fill in each of those 4 parts of the grid, develop the ideas properly, and crucially, show the links between them. It's about getting them to think in systems, see the connections.
That makes sense. And it seems like they were also pushed to think a bit like inventors themselves. I saw mention of innovation thinking tools.
Yes. That's a really neat layer. They brought in tools like ERIC, that stands for Eliminate, Reduce, Increase, Create. So the student would use that to think about maybe how the original invention could be different or improved. Plus, they had to think about trade-offs.
Always trade-offs.
Right, and things like shared value, who benefited. And even thinking about who the customer was back then. It's like applying today's innovation thinking to history.
That's quite sophisticated. Now, here's something that jumped out at me. It wasn't just about the history or the innovation side. The visual presentation was a big deal, too. Neatness, creativity, visuals supporting the ideas.
Oh, absolutely. How it looked and how the visuals were used wasn't just fluff. It was considered part of the communication. A clear layout, purposeful images that can really help explain complex stuff, can't it?
Totally. Makes sense. And that ties into the last bit, the communication of ideas itself.
Yeah.
So clarity, the student's own voice, thinking about the audience.
Exactly. It's the whole package, the analysis, the thinking process, and how clearly and effectively they communicate all of that.
Okay, so that's the project. Now, let's pivot to how it was assessed using this bias-aware assessment grid. What's the big idea behind this tool?
Well, it seems like it's trying to tackle a really fundamental question head-on. How can we actually assess student work fairly and objectively using these asset-based frameworks?
Asset-based. So focusing on the positives, the strengths.
That seems to be the core principle. It's pushing back against the idea that assessment is always neutral, and it specifically wants the evaluator, maybe a teacher, maybe with some AI help, as mentioned, to focus on what the student actually produced, their words, their structure, their visuals.
So less interpretation from the teacher, like, I wish they'd focus more on X, and more just observing what is there.
That's the idea, trying to minimize that subjective overlay. The grid gives a structure for identifying and, importantly, valuing the different strengths, the assets that are visible in the work.
Okay, so what kind of assets are we talking about? The grid seems to have different categories.
It does. One of the first is cultural and personal assets. What does that look at?
This is really interesting. It's about recognizing when a student brings in stuff from their own world. Like the example given was including local ads or newspapers from the time and the problem space section.
So connecting the historical problem to maybe a local context they understand.
Exactly. Or connecting the invention to the needs of local people, using local images that make sense to them. Even using neutral language, showing awareness, maybe. It's like saying, your background is a resource here.
That's quite powerful, isn't it? It's explicitly valuing those connections instead of ignoring them. Okay, next category. Low inference observation, AI plus teacher. Low inference, meaning sticking to the facts.
Pretty much. It seems to be about recording what you can directly see or read in the student's work without jumping to conclusions. Things like, Descriptions of how practical the invention was, lists of impacts, using bullet points, factual words, labels on visuals, and also noticing the absence of things like very emotional language or strong opinions, perhaps suggesting a more objective tone was achieved.
And the AI's role here is likely to help spot those factual statements, those objective bits, without the human tendency to, read between the lines.
That seems to be the idea. Stick to the evidence.
Makes sense. Then there's knowledge structures. How did they assess that?
This is about how the student organized their thinking. So did they actually use the four-part grid structure, problem, solution, method, evaluation? That shows a systematic approach.
Right, following the framework.
And also, did they make connections between things, like the example of linking the steam engine visually to changes in transportation? It's about seeing if they built a coherent mental map, not just isolated facts.
Got it. Seeing the system. Okay, moving on to cognitive development. This sounds like higher level thinking.
Absolutely. This is where the grid looks for evidence of things like identifying trade-offs, the pros and cons.
Okay.
Linking the invention to bigger systems, like how safety features might lead to trust, which allowed for wider adoption, maybe even enabling things like skyscrapers eventually.
Yeah.
Or that kind of cause and effect chain.
Wow, that's detailed.
Yeah, and evaluating the public impact. So really digging into the deeper thinking demonstrated.
And again, that fits the asset-based idea, perfectly spotting and valuing these complex thinking skills when they appear. What about cultural development? How is that different from cultural assets?
Good question. This seems more focused on the expression. Did the student use things like metaphors? The examples were icons for risk and profit.
Ah, symbolic representation.
Right. Or using historical drawings, creating a clear visual story, mixing different types of media. It values the sort of cultural toolkit they use to communicate their ideas creatively.
So recognizing diverse ways of showing understanding makes sense. Then formative growth.
This one feels more like a check on whether the learning stuck. Did they correctly use the specific frameworks they were taught, like ERIC or the trade-off analysis or shared value?
So applying the tools properly.
Yeah, it shows they're learning and can actually use these new concepts. It's about progress.
Okay. And the grid also mentions AI in objectivity again.
Yes, it seems to just reiterate that point, that AI helps keep things low inference, focused on facts, reducing subjectivity, a reinforcement of that principle.
Gotcha. And student-centered rubrics.
This just highlights that the assessment criteria, the rubric itself, was designed specifically for this task. It wasn't a generic rubric. It included things relevant to the project, like innovation and storytelling systems.